15 days. That's how long Cuba has before the lights go out permanently. Not a metaphor, not hyperbole. 15 actual days of oil reserves left in a country where 90% of energy comes from petroleum that no longer arrives. This is January 2026, and we're watching something almost unprecedented in modern geopolitics, an entire nation running on fumes while two global superpowers decide whether saving it is worth confronting America. But here's what makes this different from every other crisis you've read about. Cuba didn't collapse because of sanctions. It didn't fall because of protests. It imploded because on January 3rd at 2 a.m., Delta Force operators kicked down the wrong door in Caracas, or maybe exactly the right one, depending on who you ask. When they dragged Nicolás Maduro out of his compound, blindfolded and bound for a narco-terrorism trial in New York, they didn't just capture Venezuela's dictator. They severed Cuba's jugular vein. Because Cuba wasn't just Venezuela's ally, Cuba was Venezuela's security state. 32,000 Cuban operatives embedded so deep into Venezuelan intelligence that when American forces stormed that compound, they killed 32 Cuban soldiers on foreign soil. And Venezuela had been paying Cuba for this service in the only currency that mattered: oil. 46,500 barrels per day, subsidized, below market rate. The lifeblood that kept Cuban hospitals running, Cuban factories humming, Cuban homes lit. That flow stopped the moment Maduro hit American custody. Then Mexico cut its 17,000 barrels per day within weeks. Now Cuba sits in the dark, rationing electricity 4 hours at a time, watching its 15-day countdown tick towards zero. But this isn't a story about oil. This is a story about what happens when a Cold War relic becomes the chessboard where America, Russia, and China finally test how far they'll actually go. Picture Havana right now. Not the Havana of tourist postcards with classic cars and mojitos, the real Havana, where hospitals operate on 4-hour electricity windows and surgeons have to schedule operations around blackout schedules they receive via text message each morning, where families cook dinner at 2 p.m. because that's when the power might be on, where cell towers go dark for 8 hours straight, cutting off an entire city from the outside world. This is what 15 days of oil looks like in practice. But here's the part that should terrify you. Cuba has been here before. Sort of. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba lost its sugar daddy overnight. They called it the Special Period, a bureaucratic name for what was really a slow-motion famine. Cubans lost an average of 20 pounds. The economy shrank by 35%. Oxen replaced tractors because there was no diesel. Cuba survived that crisis because they had time. The collapse was gradual. They adapted. This time, there's no gradual. There's a countdown. 15 days until reserves hit zero. Then what? The Cuban government says Russia will save them. 2 tankers are reportedly en route, 90,000 barrels each, enough to buy maybe 3 more weeks. But here's the question nobody's asking publicly, but everyone's thinking privately. Why would Russia actually follow through? Because Russian oil tankers heading to Cuba have to cross waters the U.S. Navy patrols. They have to navigate around a blockade that Washington hasn't officially declared, but could enforce with a single order. They have to bet that America won't intercept those ships just to prove a point. And if you're Vladimir Putin in February 2026, watching your economy bleed from Ukraine war sanctions, watching your oil revenue drop every time Europe finds a new supplier, watching China quietly distance itself from its failed invasion, why would you pick this fight? Why would you send tankers into potential confrontation with the U.S. Navy to save an island that offers you almost nothing strategically anymore? Unless Cuba isn't the prize at all. Unless this was never about saving Cuba. Think about it. Russia doesn't need Cuba anymore, not like the Soviet Union did. During the Cold War, Cuba was the unsinkable aircraft carrier 90 miles from Florida. It was the listening post, the missile platform, the ideological thorn in America's side that justified billions in Soviet spending. But in 2026, Cuba offers Russia exactly one thing: leverage. A way to make the United States blink. Because here's what's really happening behind the scenes while Cuban families ration candles and boil water over wood fires. On February 4th, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made a statement that Western media barely covered. He said Russia was monitoring the humanitarian situation in Cuba with deep concern and that Moscow would fulfill its commitments to its historical partners. Diplomatic speak, forgettable, until you realize what he said 3 sentences later. We expect reciprocal respect for commitments in other regional matters. Other regional matters. He was talking about Ukraine, about sanctions relief, about the frozen Russian assets sitting in European banks. Russia was putting Cuba on the negotiating table. And then China made its move. February 8th, the Chinese Foreign Ministry announced a comprehensive emergency energy cooperation framework with Cuba. Not oil shipments, not tankers, a framework. Translation, we're thinking about it. But here's where it gets truly calculated. China doesn't want to save Cuba either. China wants to watch what America does when a nation in its backyard collapses in real time. They want to see if Washington will allow Russian tankers through. They want to study the response patterns, the decision trees, the red lines. Because if you're Xi Jinping and you're planning something in the South China Sea or around Taiwan in the next 5 years, Cuba is the perfect laboratory. Let Russia test American resolve. Let Cuba be the trial run. And if Cuba drowns in the process, that's just data. But here's what none of them calculated. What happens when the Cuban people stop waiting for superpowers to decide their fate?
February 11th, 2026. Havana's Malecon seawall. 3,000 people gather at sunset. Not for a protest. Not yet. They're just there. Standing in silence as the power grid shuts down across the city. Watching the lights flicker out neighborhood by neighborhood like falling dominoes until the entire coastline goes dark. Someone starts singing the national anthem. Within minutes, 3,000 voices echo across the water. By the next evening, it's 15,000. The government calls it a vigil of revolutionary solidarity. State media films it, shows people waving Cuban flags, frames it as defiance against American imperialism. But watch the footage closely. Look at the faces. That's not defiance. That's something far more dangerous. That's people realizing they have nothing left to lose. Because here's what 12 days of remaining oil does to social order. It evaporates it. Hospitals have stopped accepting new patients. Schools closed indefinitely. The government announced food rationing, but there's no food to ration because the trucks that deliver it have no diesel. Grocery store shelves sit empty, not because of shortages, but because nothing can physically move from the ports to the stores. The Cuban military, normally invisible except during parades, now guards gas stations and power substations. Not from foreign threats, from Cubans. On February 13th, a crowd of 200 people rushed a fuel depot outside Santiago de Cuba. Military police fired warning shots. The crowd didn't disperse. They pushed forward anyway. 7 people were hospitalized. The government blamed foreign agitators. But there were no foreign agitators, just desperate people watching the countdown and making a calculation. Why die slowly when you can fight? And that's when Washington realized it had a problem. Because regime change through economic collapse only works if the regime falls without creating a refugee crisis, a power vacuum, or a failed state 90 miles from Miami. The CIA's initial projections assumed Cuba's government would negotiate before total collapse, that Diaz-Canel would bend, accept American terms, expel Russian advisors, cut ties with Maduro's remnants, basically become another Venezuela, broken but manageable. Instead, Cuban leadership doubled down. They blamed America. They promised Russian tankers were coming any day now. They told people to remain calm, stay revolutionary, trust the process. But revolutions don't run on trust when the lights won't turn on. And that's when someone in the Pentagon started running worst-case scenarios. What happens when Cuba's government loses control? When 15 days hits zero and the oil doesn't come?
What happens when 2 million Cubans look at the ocean between them and Florida and start building rafts? The scenario has a name inside the Pentagon: Mariel 2.0. In 1980, Fidel Castro opened the port of Mariel and told Cubans they could leave. 125,000 people fled to Florida in 6 months. It overwhelmed the Coast Guard, strained refugee processing, and created a political crisis that helped cost Jimmy Carter the presidency. That was 125,000 people leaving because they wanted to. Now imagine 2 million leaving because they have to. Because when the oil hits zero, Cuba doesn't just lose electricity. The water treatment plants stop running. Sewage systems fail. Disease spreads. The very infrastructure of survival collapses. And Florida is 90 miles away. The Coast Guard has already redeployed cutters to the Florida Straits, not to rescue refugees, but to turn them back. But international maritime law says you can't force a boat in distress back into danger, and every single raft that launches from Cuba will be in distress by definition. So here's the nightmare scenario Washington is trying to prevent. Thousands of Cubans drown in the crossing. The ones who make it land on Miami beaches, Fort Lauderdale shores, Key West docks. Images of dead children washing up on American sand flood social media. Suddenly, the humanitarian crisis America created through economic warfare becomes America's problem to solve on live television. And that's exactly what Russia and China have been waiting for. Because the moment America blinks, the moment Washington sends humanitarian aid, or allows Russian tankers through, or lifts sanctions to prevent mass death, the whole strategy collapses. Regime change through economic pressure only works if you're willing to let people die to prove you're serious. And America just proved in Venezuela they're willing to launch midnight raids and arrest foreign leaders. But are they willing to let the cameras show floating bodies between Havana and Miami? That's the real countdown. Not 15 days until Cuba runs out of oil. 15 days until we find out if anyone's actually coming to help. 15 days until Cuba becomes either a warning to every nation that challenges American power, or proof that empires create the chaos they can no longer manage. The countdown is running, and nobody knows what happens when it hits zero.